Welcome to Unexpected Grace, a powerful story about change, redemption, and the unexpected ways that kindness reshapes lives. Meet George and Martha Harlan, an elderly couple set in their ways and shaped by old prejudices. But when a sudden medical crisis leaves them relying on the very person they once scorned, Dr. Elijah Brooks, a compassionate black neurosurgeon, their world begins to shift. This chance encounter pushes George and Martha down a path they never expected, challenging their beliefs and leading them to a legacy of compassion that transforms an entire community. Will they truly embrace change? And how far will their journey take them? Join us on this emotional journey by subscribing and tapping the notification bell for more stories that inspire. And tell us in the comments, do you believe in second chances? Now, let's dive into Unexpected Grace. The mall hummed with life, pulsing with the vibrant energy of a Saturday morning. Teenagers in groups, mothers pushing strollers, people hurrying with bags in hand, all blending into the current of people moving along the glossy tiled floors. Martha and George Harlan moved among them, standing out like stiff rocks in a moving stream. Martha, in her light lavender cardigan and pearl earrings, looked around with an expression of disapproval. She tightened her grip on George's arm as a group of young people with brightly colored hair walked by, laughing loudly. "This place used to be more refined," she murmured to George, as though the weight of the mall's past sophistication lay heavily on her shoulders. George grunted in agreement. "This country's going to the dogs," he replied, just loud enough for his words to be lost in the mall's chatter. No respect. No values left. They were on their way to pick up a few necessities. A new belt for George, a sweater for Martha, and maybe, if they could find it, a nice new frame for their granddaughter's picture. Both of them agreed it was difficult to find anything of quality these days. But what they noticed more than the changing products was the change in the people. They could hardly recognize the world they lived in now. As they waited in line at a coffee kiosk, a tall black man stepped in a line a few feet away, seemingly absorbed in his phone. Martha glanced at him, then nudged George's arm. "Would you look at that?" she muttered. George looked, his face darkening slightly. "Figures," he replied, muttering something under his breath. Elijah, though standing only a few feet away, didn't seem to notice their quiet disdain. He glanced up, offering a polite nod to those in line as he waited his turn, his demeanor calm and composed. As Elijah finally stepped up to the counter to place his order, Martha whispered to George again, "And look, there he goes, probably ordering something he can't even pronounce." She chuckled under her breath. George smirked, nodding. They turned away, dismissing him. But Elijah, overhearing them this time, glanced back briefly, his eyes meeting theirs. He held the gaze for a moment, his eyes steady, then simply turned back to pay for his coffee, his expression calm but unreadable. As they moved to find a table, Martha huffed. "Bold, isn't he?" she whispered, as though the man's dignity was somehow an affront to her. George said nothing, but his jaw tightened. They found seats in the busy food court, settling down with their coffee and light snacks. George was mid-sentence, grumbling about a news article he'd read that morning, when Martha's hand suddenly went limp in his. "Martha?" he asked, surprised by the abrupt silence. But Martha's face was tilted strangely, and her eyes had an unnatural droop. "Martha!" George's voice rose, drawing the attention of people around them. Suddenly, she slumped forward, her arms sliding off the table as her head tilted down, her eyes wide and unfocused. Panic surged through him. "Help! Somebody help her!" George shouted, his voice cracking. He looked around, his face twisted in desperate confusion as he tried to lift Martha upright. Several people began gathering, though they seemed unsure of what to do. In the crowd, a familiar face appeared, moving purposefully. It was Elijah. He pushed through the onlookers, quickly assessing the scene. Without hesitation, Elijah dropped his coffee and knelt beside Martha. "Sir, please, let me help her," he said firmly, already reaching to feel for her pulse. George, torn between desperation and the instinct to reject help from this man he'd silently judged only moments before, hesitated. But he saw the calm, capable look in Elijah's eyes, a look that made it clear this man knew what he was doing. George nodded reluctantly, his hand shaking as he withdrew it from Martha's arm. She just collapsed, George stammered, looking at Elijah with a mix of fear and confusion. Elijah's face softened, his focus unwavering. Stay calm. I'm Dr. Elijah Brooks, he said, pressing his fingers gently but confidently along Martha's neck, then listening closely to her breaths. She needs immediate care. He began issuing instructions to those nearby, asking someone to call an ambulance and another to grab a nearby mall defibrillator, just in case. The crowd obeyed, moved by the doctor's calm authority. As the minutes passed, George found himself clutching Martha's limp hand, looking up only to see Elijah checking her pulse, his face a mask of concentration. Elijah's competence was unmistakable, his movements precise and reassuring. Despite his earlier judgment, George felt a growing sense of relief at the doctor's presence. The ambulance arrived, whisking Martha away with Elijah accompanying them, while George followed in the car. The emergency room buzzed with quiet urgency as Martha was rushed into a treatment area. George, left in the waiting room, felt hollow, the shock of the situation settling in. Time lost its meaning as he sat there, gripping the arms of his chair, so tightly his knuckles turned white. He barely noticed the sounds around him, the steady hum of the hospital, the beeping machines, the hushed voices of nurses and doctors. Finally, Elijah emerged, his expression calm but serious. He approached George, his demeanor as professional as ever, though George saw a faint softness in his gaze. Mr. Harlan, Martha has had a severe stroke, he said gently, each word measured and clear. She's stable for now, but we'll need to monitor her closely. The next 24 hours will be critical. George nodded numbly, the words barely sinking in. He managed to whisper, "Thank you, Dr. Brooks." Elijah gave a small nod. "She's in good hands. We'll do everything we can." As George sat alone in the waiting room, his mind returned to the events of the morning. He thought about how he and Martha had mocked Elijah, a man who was now working to save her life. He felt a hot wave of shame rise in his chest. He thought back over the years, over countless little comments he and Martha had made, over the quiet judgments they'd passed without thinking. For the first time, he questioned them, and it hurt like an old wound exposed to fresh air. In that moment, George realized that he hadn't just misjudged Elijah today. He'd been judging him, and others like him, for a lifetime. The waiting room felt sterile and hollow, a place where time seemed to stretch and compress in strange ways. George slumped forward in his chair, staring at the ground, his mind a haze of worry and exhaustion. People came and went, doctors and nurses moving efficiently through the halls, but George barely registered them. All he could see was Martha's face, pale and still as he'd last seen her. A young nurse appeared at his side. "Would you like some water, sir?" George looked up, blinking. "Yes, thank you," he murmured, accepting the cup. His hands shook as he took a sip, the coolness of the water grounding him for just a moment. The minutes ticked by. An hour. Then another. His mind wandered back to the moments in the mall, the way he and Martha had dismissed Elijah Brooks so quickly and thoughtlessly. A pang of guilt settled in his chest as he recalled the man's calm, confident hands working to save her life, the way he'd taken control of the chaotic scene without hesitation. There had been nothing in Elijah's eyes but focus and care, not even a flicker of anger toward him or Martha, despite their behavior. The shame grew, a creeping sense of regret he couldn't shake. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, running his hand over his face, feeling every year of his age. Lost in his thoughts, George barely noticed the footsteps approaching until a figure stopped in front of him. Looking up, he saw Elijah Brooks standing there, his expression calm but concerned. "Mr. Harlan?" Elijah asked, his tone respectful, yet there was a softness there, a gentleness that George hadn't expected. George felt his face flush, his mind scrambling for words. He struggled to meet Elijah's gaze, but finally forced himself to nod. "Yes, doctor. How? How is she?" Elijah took a seat beside him, giving George the courtesy of sitting at his level, his hands clasped thoughtfully. "Martha is in the ICU, and she's stable," he began. The next day or so will be crucial for her recovery. She's had a major stroke, and we'll be watching closely for any signs of improvement or complications." George swallowed hard, nodding stiffly. He tried to muster a thank you, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. How could he thank a man he'd just looked down upon with such ease? And yet here was Elijah, a man he hardly knew, now the one holding his wife's fate in his hands. "Dr. Brooks," George began, his voice barely above a whisper, I don't know what to say. You didn't have to step in today. You could have walked away." Elijah's expression didn't waver. "I became a doctor to help people, Mr. Harlan," he replied simply. "My job is to care for anyone who needs it, regardless of anything else. Your wife is my patient, and I'll do everything I can to help her recover." The words cut deeper than George anticipated. The simplicity of Elijah's kindness, somehow making his own prejudice feel even sharper. He cleared his throat, feeling a pang of something that he couldn't quite name, something raw and uncomfortable, and yet oddly liberating. After Elijah left, George found himself unable to shake the thoughts swirling in his mind. He sat in silence, alone in the sterile, fluorescent-lit waiting room, the hum of the hospital machinery filling the empty spaces of his thoughts. For the first time, he began to think deeply about his own life, his choices, and the beliefs that had shaped him. He remembered his own father's words, sharp, bitter words, spoken over Sunday dinners, about how the world was changing for the worse, how people needed to know their place. Growing up, George had accepted those ideas without question, absorbing them like he'd absorbed everything else his parents taught him. And while he and Martha had never been overtly cruel, they'd held on to those beliefs, justifying them as part of the way things were. But now, as he sat in that waiting room, George felt something else creeping into his mind. Doubt. Doubt about the fairness of those ideas. Doubt about whether he'd ever really seen people like Elijah Brooks as human beings, or if he'd only seen them as symbols of some distant, uncomfortable other. He felt a strange pang in his chest, a feeling he could barely recognize as guilt. He thought back to Elijah's calm, steady presence that day, the way he'd moved through the crowd with purpose and compassion. George wondered if he'd ever shown anyone that kind of kindness, if he'd ever looked beyond his own narrow view of the world long enough to recognize another person's worth. A soft knock interrupted George's thoughts, and he looked up to see a middle-aged black nurse standing in front of him, holding a clipboard. Her badge read, Dana Powell, RN. She offered a gentle smile. "Mr. Harlan, would you like to see your wife?" she asked softly. George nodded, a wave of relief washing over him. He followed Dana down the hallway, the antiseptic smell of the hospital suddenly sharp in his nostrils. As they walked, he glanced at her, noticing the kindness in her eyes, the steady warmth in her voice as she updated him on Martha's condition. "Thank you, Miss Powell," he murmured awkwardly as they reached the ICU doors. She turned to him, her expression understanding. "You're welcome, Mr. Harlan," she replied gently, and for a moment, George saw a glimpse of something unspoken, a quiet resilience, a kind of inner strength he'd rarely noticed in others. Inside the ICU, he found Martha lying peacefully, her face pale but calm, her breathing steady. Machines beeped softly around her, a low rhythm that somehow steadied his own racing heart. He sat beside her, reaching for her hand, feeling the coolness of her skin beneath his fingertips. As he sat there, he thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. And for the first time, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years, a desire to change, to understand. It was just a flicker, a faint sense of possibility, but it was there. As the hours wore on, George sat alone by Martha's bedside, holding her hand and thinking back over the years. His life stretched out before him, filled with moments he had rarely questioned, moments in which he had judged others without ever pausing to consider what those judgments meant. He thought about his father, the way his voice would drop to a low, harsh tone whenever he spoke about anyone who didn't fit his narrow ideals. He thought about his own words to Martha earlier that day, the quiet derision in his tone as he'd mocked a man who'd done nothing but stand in line for a cup of coffee. Now that derision felt empty, pointless. How many other moments had he dismissed? How many other people had he judged without understanding them? And how many of those people, he wondered, might have shown him kindness if he'd only given them the chance? He felt a surge of shame and, beneath it, a strange sense of release. He'd been holding on to those beliefs for so long, carrying them like a shield. But now, in the stillness of that hospital room, he felt the first stirrings of a new understanding, a recognition that he'd been wrong, that he'd been blind. And as he sat there, George knew that when he left this hospital, he wouldn't leave the same man who had walked in. For the first time in his life, he wanted to do more than just exist. He wanted to change. The ICU became George's world over the next day. He spent each hour waiting by Martha's side, watching her breathing, counting each exhalation as if it were a blessing. Nurses and doctors moved in and out of the room, adjusting her medication, checking her vitals, and asking George if he needed anything. His polite refusals became habitual, each a ritual that kept him grounded. It was nearly noon on the second day when Dr. Elijah Brooks entered the room again, this time with a more familiar air. George looked up as Elijah gave him a respectful nod, his eyes trained on Martha as he checked the monitors and recorded her progress. "Mr. Harlan, I'm happy to report that your wife is showing signs of improvement," Elijah said, his voice steady and reassuring. "The initial damage from the stroke was severe, but her vital signs are stable, and her responsiveness is beginning to improve. It's a promising sign." George felt a wave of relief rush through him, as though a weight had been lifted from his chest. "Thank you, doctor," he murmured, his voice catching slightly. He cleared his throat. You've done so much for her already." "For us." Elijah nodded, his expression unreadable but kind. "That's why I'm here, Mr. Harlan," he said simply. "My job is to provide care and support when it's needed." George looked down, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and guilt. "Doctor," he began slowly, his voice thick with emotion. I have something I need to say." Elijah remained silent, his attention focused on George, his expression open but neutral. "I realize that you're probably used to people like me," George continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "People who don't see you for who you are. People who judge you without reason." Elijah's gaze softened, though he didn't interrupt. George took a shaky breath, feeling the weight of his words as they hung in the air. "I'm sorry. I was wrong to judge you. I thought I had all the answers. Thought I knew people based on what I'd been taught to believe. But now I see how wrong I was." A long silence settled between them, punctuated only by the steady beeping of Martha's heart monitor. Elijah nodded, his face thoughtful. "I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Harlan," he replied gently. "But I think it's important to remember that understanding doesn't come in a single moment. It takes time. You've taken a step, but that step is part of a longer journey." George felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name, a sense of relief, mixed with humility. "I suppose you're right," he murmured. "I have a lot to learn." As the days passed, Martha's strength continued to grow, her progress steady and encouraging. George began to leave the ICU for short breaks, heading down to the hospital cafeteria for coffee or a quick bite. He noticed the people around him, the patients, families, nurses, and doctors, all moving in a rhythm he'd never really paid attention to before. One afternoon, he returned to the ICU and found a small note by Martha's bedside. It was written in tidy handwriting, signed with the name Dana Powell, RN, the same nurse who had first taken him to see Martha. "Mr. Harlan, just a reminder that you're not alone. If you need anything, please ask." It was a simple gesture, but it struck George deeply. He folded the note and slipped it into his pocket, feeling the weight of kindness, of being seen and cared for in a way he hadn't expected. From that day forward, George began to look at each staff member he encountered with fresh eyes, seeing them not as strangers, but as people with stories, with lives and struggles of their own. His mind returned again and again to Elijah's words. Understanding doesn't come in a single moment. 3 weeks after her stroke, Martha's condition had stabilized enough for her to be moved out of the ICU to a rehabilitation floor. She was still weak, her speech slightly slurred, but the light in her eyes was unmistakable. George was by her side each day, helping her through her exercises, encouraging her through the smallest victories. One evening, as George sat with Martha, she looked at him with an expression of curiosity. "George, I remember something," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "The man in the mall, the doctor, he helped me, didn't he?" George nodded, his gaze soft. "Yes, Martha. His name is Dr. Elijah Brooks. He saved your life." Martha's eyes filled with gratitude, her voice trembling. I think I remember his face. I'd like to thank George properly." George's heart swelled, his chest tightening. He realized that he'd been holding on to the hope that one day they'd both have a chance to express their gratitude, a hope that had now become real. A few days later, after Martha had shown more improvement, George found the courage to approach Elijah. He waited until he caught him alone in a hallway, finally gathering the nerve to speak. "Dr. Brooks, my wife, she'd like to thank you," George said, his voice steady but filled with earnestness. "And we'd both like to invite you to dinner once she's out of the hospital. I know it might seem odd considering, but it's important to us." Elijah's gaze held a trace of surprise, but he nodded, his expression warm. "Thank you, Mr. Harlan. I'd be honored." As George walked away, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of change, real change, settling into his bones. He knew that this dinner wouldn't erase a lifetime of prejudice, but it was a step, a chance to extend his gratitude in a way that mattered. The dinner took place a month later at a small restaurant near the hospital. George and Martha arrived early, nervous but hopeful, each dressed in their Sunday best. They watched the door anxiously, both relieved and slightly on edge when Elijah walked in, his presence filling the small space with a quiet dignity. As they sat down, George felt his palms grow clammy. The awkwardness of the situation loomed over them, but Elijah's warm smile quickly eased the tension. The evening unfolded gradually, their conversation light at first, but soon drifting to deeper topics. Martha spoke about her gratitude for her recovery, about how each day felt like a gift. George, listening to her words, felt a lump rise in his throat, realizing the depth of his gratitude, not just for Elijah's actions, but for the man himself. Midway through the meal, George found himself sharing a story from his childhood, a story about his father, a man who had carried rigid beliefs about keeping to one's own. He spoke carefully, aware of the deep-rooted biases he was exposing, but he could see that Elijah understood. Elijah listened quietly, his gaze compassionate. "Thank you for sharing that, Mr. Harlan," he replied, his voice soft but steady. "It takes courage to confront the things we've been taught. Sometimes those lessons run deep, and it can be hard to unlearn them." George nodded, his throat tight. He glanced at Martha, who offered him a small, supportive smile. He felt as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, a weight he'd carried for so long that he'd almost forgotten it was there. In the weeks that followed, George and Martha began to incorporate what they had learned into their daily lives. They started volunteering at the hospital, Martha reading to patients and George helping to organize supplies. Each interaction brought them face to face with people of all backgrounds, individuals whose stories and struggles reminded them of Elijah's unwavering kindness. George noticed that his perspective on people began to shift. He saw humanity where he'd once seen only difference. He found himself reaching out to those he might have once ignored, sharing a smile or a kind word, each interaction a small step toward a new way of being. Their world had changed, not in any dramatic, sweeping sense, but in a quiet, powerful way. They'd begun to rebuild, brick by brick, a life they'd never imagined before. One day, George and Martha returned to the mall where it had all begun. They walked together, hand in hand, through the bustling corridors, feeling the world around them with fresh eyes. As they passed the coffee stand where they'd first encountered Elijah, George felt a surge of gratitude, a profound sense of peace. He looked at Martha, his heart full. "You know, I think this is only the beginning," he murmured, his voice filled with conviction. Martha nodded, her eyes warm. "Yes, George," she replied softly. "I think so too." They continued to walk, feeling the weight of the past slip away, replaced by the promise of a new beginning. As the days turned into weeks, Martha's strength began to return. She still struggled with her speech, her words sometimes slipping away mid-sentence, but her progress was undeniable. With George's help, she moved from using a wheelchair to taking tentative steps with a walker, her resolve as fierce as ever. George was with her each day, offering steady encouragement. Watching her work through the smallest challenges filled him with pride and renewed gratitude. They took each accomplishment as a victory, each day an opportunity to rebuild what they had almost lost. Yet for George, these quiet moments were marked by an undercurrent of introspection. The memory of Elijah's compassion lingered in his mind, sparking questions he hadn't considered in years. As he observed Martha's journey, he realized he, too, was experiencing his own kind of recovery, a healing of the heart and mind. One evening, as they sat together in the hospital room, Martha looked at George with an expression he hadn't seen in some time. Her voice, though soft, held a note of strength. "George," she said, choosing her words carefully, "you've been different since the stroke." George looked at her, surprised. He hadn't expected her to notice, but now that she'd said it, he felt a strange mixture of relief and vulnerability. "I suppose I have," he admitted, his voice low. "I've been thinking a lot about things I never gave a second thought to before." Martha gave a slight nod, her gaze steady. "You mean Dr. Brooks?" she murmured, her voice laced with gratitude. "What he did? George, it changed something in me too. I can't quite explain it, but it feels like a gift." He reached for her hand, his grip gentle yet firm. "I know exactly what you mean, Martha," he said. "It's as if he held up a mirror to everything I thought I knew, everything I believed. And now, I can't ignore what I see." They sat in silence for a while, their hands entwined, each of them processing the enormity of their shared experience. For George, it felt as though a lifetime of barriers had begun to fall away, leaving him exposed yet strangely unburdened. George couldn't shake the feeling that he had been handed an opportunity to change, an opportunity he could no longer ignore. The old judgments, the biases he'd once held so tightly, felt foreign to him now, like relics of a life he no longer wanted. One night, he found himself lying awake, his thoughts drifting back to his father. He remembered sitting at their dinner table as a child, listening to his father's gruff voice, the way he'd spoken about people from different backgrounds with a tone of derision that George had absorbed without question. Those memories felt bitter now, tinged with regret. He wondered how different his life might have been if he'd questioned those ideas, if he'd dared to see the world through his own eyes rather than through the narrow lens his family had handed him. He felt a pang of guilt, realizing that he had spent so many years passing those same judgments down to Martha, believing he was protecting her, shielding her from a world he barely understood. He made a silent promise to himself, a vow to let go of the old beliefs, to try to see the world and the people in it with new eyes. After Martha was discharged from the hospital and returned home, George's determination to make amends grew. He felt a persistent urge to speak to Dr. Brooks, to offer a more personal gesture of gratitude. He began writing a letter, hoping to express the depth of his appreciation, but the words felt hollow on the page. Each attempt felt inadequate, as though nothing could capture the enormity of his feelings. Finally, he decided to speak with Elijah in person. He called the hospital and arranged a time to visit Dr. Brooks at his office. When the day arrived, George felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. He'd prepared a short speech, hoping it would convey his gratitude, yet he feared it would fall short. But he knew that simply showing up was part of his commitment to change, and he was determined to follow through. Sitting in Dr. Brooks's office, George felt a sense of humility he hadn't felt in years. When Elijah entered the room, his expression warm and welcoming, George felt his nervousness dissolve slightly. "Thank you for seeing me, Dr. Brooks," he began, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "I know you're a busy man, and I'm sure I'm not the first person to come in here to thank you, but I needed to say it in person. You saved my wife, and you showed me something I hadn't seen before. You changed me." Elijah listened, his face attentive, his eyes kind. "Mr. Harlan, I'm glad to hear that Martha is doing well," he replied. and I'm grateful that you took the time to come here. George took a deep breath, gathering the courage to continue. I want you to know that I judged you unfairly. And not just you, but people I didn't know or understand. I grew up in a different world, a world that shaped my beliefs in ways I never questioned. But now I see how wrong I was, and I want to make it right. Elijah's gaze softened, his expression thoughtful. Understanding can be a journey, Mr. Harlan. It doesn't come all at once, and it often takes time and patience. What matters is that you're willing to change. George nodded, feeling a deep sense of relief. Thank you, Dr. Brooks, he said, his voice choked with emotion. Thank you for giving me this chance. And if there's ever anything I could do for you or your family, please just let me know. Elijah extended his hand, and George shook it firmly, feeling a warmth and respect he'd never thought possible. In the days that followed, George found himself looking at the world through different eyes. He began to notice the subtle kindnesses of strangers, the quiet resilience of people he'd once overlooked. His world expanded, as though he were seeing it for the first time. Martha, too, embraced the change, her own journey toward understanding a reflection of George's. Together, they made small efforts to give back to their community, volunteering at the local hospital, helping families who were navigating their own struggles. Their lives, once narrow and predictable, became filled with moments of connection and empathy. George found himself reaching out to people he would have once ignored, offering a helping hand, a kind word, each interaction a small testament to his transformation. One afternoon, while visiting the mall for the first time since Martha's stroke, George encountered a young man struggling with a large box near the entrance. The man looked around, his eyes darting nervously, as though unsure if anyone would help him. Without hesitation, George approached the man, extending a hand. "Here, let me help you with that," he said, his voice warm and reassuring. The young man looked at George with surprise, then gratitude, as they lifted the box together. George felt a surge of pride, a sense of purpose that filled him with quiet satisfaction. For the first time, he felt as though he were truly living his values, embodying the lessons he had learned. As they set the box down, the young man smiled. "Thank you, sir." Not everyone would have stopped to help. George returned the smile, feeling a warmth in his chest. "Sometimes, all we need is a little kindness," he replied. "Take care of yourself, son." That evening, as George and Martha sat on their front porch, watching the sunset, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He knew there were still challenges ahead, still moments of doubt and uncertainty, but he was determined to face them with an open heart. He looked at Martha, his hand resting over hers. "Martha, I want us to keep going, to keep learning, to keep growing. We can't change the past, but we can shape the future." Martha nodded, her eyes filled with love and understanding. "Yes, George," she replied softly. "We've been given a second chance. Let's make it count." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, George felt the weight of his old life fall away, leaving only the promise of what lay ahead. He knew his journey was just beginning, a journey toward compassion, understanding, and the hope of a better tomorrow. After Martha's recovery, George and Martha began spending time at a local community center, a small but lively space that offered resources and support to families in need. They had started by helping to organize donations, but soon found themselves drawn into the heart of the center's mission, building a place of connection and compassion for people from all walks of life. Their involvement brought them into contact with a range of people: single mothers, young people from underprivileged backgrounds, and elderly folks who came to the center for companionship. The experience was new and sometimes uncomfortable, yet they were surprised by the warmth and resilience they encountered in each story shared, each person they met. One afternoon, George was carrying boxes of donated food to the center's pantry when he spotted a familiar face, Dana Powell, the nurse who had tended to Martha during her stay in the hospital. She was organizing clothing donations with another volunteer, chatting cheerfully. "Dana," George called out, his voice tinged with both surprise and gratitude. Dana turned, breaking into a warm smile. "Mr. Harlan, it's good to see you," she said, coming over to shake his hand. They talked briefly, catching up, and George found himself thanking her again for her kindness. Dana, with a gracious smile, brushed it off with humility. "Everyone here is just trying to give back a little," she replied. "We're all in this together." As he walked away, George felt a profound sense of connection, the kind that reached beyond words. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be part of a community, to stand alongside others in shared purpose. As George and Martha's involvement in the center deepened, they also began facing remnants of their own past biases reflected back at them in the attitudes of others. One evening, George overheard a conversation between two men at the center. They were muttering about a young volunteer named Isaiah, a college student who had been leading a new youth program. George heard one of them dismiss Isaiah's efforts, using a derogatory term in a low voice. The word stung, a painful reminder of his own past judgments. George felt a flash of anger, his heart pounding. Without fully thinking, he turned to the men and spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You might want to think twice before saying things like that," he said quietly. "Everyone here deserves respect." The men looked at him in surprise, one of them muttering an apology as they quickly walked away. George stood there, feeling a surge of pride mixed with unease. Confronting his own past actions wasn't easy, but he realized it was a necessary part of the journey. He knew he'd have to keep challenging not only his own beliefs but those of others as well. As the weeks passed, George felt a growing need to express his gratitude to Dr. Brooks in a meaningful way. He'd seen how Elijah's example had inspired him, guiding him down a path he hadn't even known existed. After speaking with Martha, they decided to contribute to the hospital in Dr. Brooks's honor. With the help of the hospital's administrative team, they arranged for a scholarship fund to be set up for aspiring medical students from underrepresented communities. The fund would support young people who, like Elijah, might one day bring compassion and healing to the world. They called the fund the Brooks Scholarship for Medical Excellence. Though they hadn't told Elijah about their plan, they knew it would carry forward the impact of his work in a way that reached far beyond a single act of kindness. To celebrate the establishment of the scholarship fund, George and Martha invited Elijah and his family to dinner, hoping to share their gratitude in a more personal setting. When Elijah and his wife, Simone, arrived with their two teenage children, the atmosphere was filled with warmth and laughter. Over the meal, George found himself captivated by the stories shared. Simone, a teacher, spoke passionately about her work in education, her voice carrying the same strength and empathy that Elijah displayed. Their children, bright and curious, listened intently, occasionally chiming in with their own insights. George couldn't help but feel humbled by the richness of their lives, the depth of their experiences. As they talked, he realized just how much he had missed by shutting himself off from people like Elijah, people with stories and wisdom that were different from his own. Toward the end of the evening, George finally shared the news of the scholarship. "Dr. Brooks," he began, his voice choked with emotion, "we've established a scholarship fund in your name. It's for students who want to pursue medicine but might not have the means. It's our way of saying thank you for everything you've done for us." Elijah looked at George, his expression one of genuine surprise and gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Harlan. This is beyond anything I could have imagined. I'm honored." As they embraced, George felt the weight of his gratitude fully sink in. He knew that this gesture couldn't erase the past, but it was a step, a bridge built on understanding, on the chance to make something beautiful out of what had once been a source of division. The weeks following the dinner were filled with quiet fulfillment. George and Martha continued their work at the community center, their lives now interwoven with people they once might never have known. Each day brought small acts of kindness, moments of connection that reminded them of the richness that lay beyond the boundaries they had once set. The scholarship fund began to grow, with contributions from people who had been touched by Elijah's work and inspired by his example. Young people from diverse backgrounds applied, each one carrying dreams of making a difference, of following in Elijah's footsteps. George attended the first scholarship ceremony, standing in the back as Dr. Brooks handed the award to a young woman named Tasha, who was beginning her medical journey. The look of joy on her face, the pride in Elijah's eyes, It was a sight George would carry with him always. As he stood there, George felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He realized that while he couldn't change the past, he could help shape the future, leaving behind a legacy of kindness, respect, and understanding. One Sunday, George and Martha returned to the mall for the first time since Martha's stroke. Walking through the bustling corridors, they found themselves near the coffee kiosk where their story had truly begun. They sat at a small table, sipping their drinks and watching the world go by. The mall was filled with people of all ages and backgrounds, each person moving through their own unique story. George looked at Martha, a quiet smile playing on his lips. "It's strange, isn't it?" he said. "We used to sit here and judge people we didn't even know. Now, all I see are stories, people with lives as complex as ours, each one trying to find their way." Martha reached for his hand, her expression tender. "We've come a long way, George," she replied. "And I think Elijah was right. Change doesn't happen in a single moment. But if you keep choosing it day by day, it becomes real." They sat there, hand in hand, feeling the weight of their journey, the quiet beauty of transformation. They had once been bound by prejudice, trapped by beliefs that had kept them apart from the world. But now, they were free to embrace a life defined not by fear, but by understanding. As they left the mall that day, George felt a sense of closure, a quiet joy that filled him with hope for the future. In the years that followed, George and Martha became known in their community as people who were always willing to lend a hand, to listen, to learn. Their story spread quietly, reaching people who found hope in their transformation. The Brooks Scholarship grew, each new recipient a testament to the power of kindness and second chances. And though George and Martha's journey was far from over, they knew they had built something lasting, a life shaped by grace, by the simple, profound decision to choose love over fear. George often thought of Elijah, of the kindness he had shown them in the face of their own prejudice. That kindness had saved Martha's life, but it had also saved them both in ways they hadn't fully understood at the time. It was a gift they would carry forever, a reminder that true transformation was possible, no matter where you began. And as George looked back on his life, he knew he would forever be grateful for that one act of unexpected grace. As George and Martha became more involved at the community center, they took on additional roles. George assisting with organizing events, and Martha running a small reading group for young children. Each day brought new faces, new stories, and new opportunities for them to test the depth of their transformation. They became fixtures at the center, embraced by a community they once viewed with quiet judgment. One day, the center director approached George with a proposal. "We're planning an event to celebrate our volunteers and honor the work everyone's done. I'd like you to speak, George. You've been an inspiration around here." George hesitated, a swell of pride mixed with humility filling his chest. "Me? I'm not much of a public speaker," he replied, scratching his head. The director smiled. "Just share your story, George. I think people would be touched to hear it. Sometimes, the most powerful messages come from ordinary experiences." That night, George sat with Martha, contemplating what he might say. "I don't know if I'm ready to talk about everything," he confessed. "What if I make a fool of myself?" Martha squeezed his hand, her eyes warm with understanding. "Just speak from the heart, George. We come a long way. People here will understand." On the night of the event, the community center filled with families, volunteers, and staff, all gathered to celebrate the impact they had made together. When George took the small stage, he felt a flutter of nervousness. But as he looked out over the crowd, he saw the familiar faces of those who had welcomed him and Martha with open arms. "Thank you all for being here tonight," George began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "When Martha and I first came here, we were just two old folks looking to pass the time. But what we found was more than we could have imagined." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I have to be honest with you all," he continued, his tone sincere. "I grew up with certain ideas that shaped how I saw people who didn't look like me, who didn't come from my world. And for years, I carried those ideas with me, thinking I understood the world." He glanced at Martha, who smiled encouragingly. But then something happened, he said, his voice softening. My wife, Martha, had a stroke. And when she collapsed in that mall, a man came to our aid. A man I had looked down on without even knowing him. That man saved her life, and in doing so, he saved me too. The room was silent, every eye on George as he spoke. That man's name is Dr. Elijah Brooks, and he taught me that kindness and courage have no color, no boundaries. He taught me that every person has a story worth listening to. George took a shaky breath, feeling the weight of his words. So, tonight I just want to say thank you. Thank you to each of you who welcomed us here, who gave us a chance to be part of something bigger than ourselves. We may have started this journey a little late, but it's one we're committed to for the rest of our lives. When he finished, the room erupted into applause, and George felt a warmth flood through him, a sense of belonging, of acceptance that he had never known before. The following week, George received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Brooks. Elijah's voice held a note of quiet respect, and George sensed he had listened to the recording of the speech, which had been shared online by the community center. Mr. Harlan, I wanted to tell you how much your words meant to me, Elijah said. I know how difficult it can be to confront the past, to take that kind of journey. But I also know how powerful it can be. George swallowed, feeling a wave of gratitude. Thank you, Dr. Brooks. I owe you so much. I hope you know that. Elijah paused, his tone gentle. Sometimes, George, the best way to repay a debt is to keep moving forward, to keep learning. You've already begun. The impact you're making in the community is proof of that. The conversation ended with an understanding that went beyond words. George felt both humbled and encouraged, as if he had been given permission to release the final remnants of his past. A few months later, the community center organized a large gathering, inviting people from various backgrounds to celebrate unity, understanding, and the importance of building bridges. George and Martha volunteered to help organize the event, setting up tables, arranging food, and creating a warm, welcoming environment. Dr. Brooks was invited as a guest speaker, along with other community leaders who shared their stories of resilience, forgiveness, and transformation. The gathering attracted families, young people, and elderly folks, all coming together to share a meal and hear words of inspiration. When Dr. Brooks took the stage, George watched from the audience, feeling a sense of pride and gratitude he could barely contain. Elijah spoke with the same calm authority George remembered from the day at the mall, but this time, his words were directed at a larger cause. We are all here tonight because we believe in the power of understanding, Elijah said. We believe that no matter where we come from, what we look like, or what we've been through, we have the power to change. And that change doesn't just impact us, it impacts our families, our communities, and the generations that follow. The crowd erupted in applause, and George felt a swell of emotion rise in his chest. He glanced at Martha, who gave his hand a gentle squeeze, her eyes shining with pride. As the evening drew to a close, Elijah made his way over to George and Martha, offering them both a warm smile. George felt a surge of emotion, a profound sense of gratitude that went beyond words. Dr. Brooks, George began, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for everything. For what you did that day, and for what you've done since. You changed us. Elijah smiled, his expression both understanding and kind. George, I think you changed yourselves, he replied gently. All I did was open a door. You walked through it on your own. Martha reached out, embracing Elijah in a gesture that needed no words. George followed, shaking Elijah's hand with a firm grip, their shared understanding binding them in a quiet but powerful bond. As they parted, George felt a profound sense of closure, a recognition that he had found a kind of peace he never thought possible. He realized that true reconciliation came not from forgetting the past, but from acknowledging it, from moving forward with an open heart and a willingness to learn. In the days that followed, George and Martha continued their work at the community center, their lives filled with purpose and connection. They knew they were not the same people they had once been, and they were grateful for it. Their lives were fuller, richer, defined by compassion rather than judgment. George often thought back to the day in the mall, remembering the man who had extended him a kindness that transcended prejudice. Elijah Brooks had shown him a new way of being, a new way of seeing the world, and George was determined to honor that gift for as long as he lived. Together, he and Martha had reclaimed their lives, stepping into a future defined by grace, by the quiet, powerful choice to love and understand. The first Brooks Scholarship ceremony arrived on a bright spring morning, held in a beautiful auditorium filled with friends, family, and community members. George and Martha sat toward the front, surrounded by staff from the community center, nurses and doctors from the hospital, and students eagerly awaiting the awards. As the program began, George felt a sense of awe. What had started as a simple gesture of gratitude had grown into something far bigger than he had imagined. The scholarship, inspired by Elijah's unwavering kindness, was now funding medical education for underrepresented youth. George saw it as an opportunity to honor Elijah, but also as a way to extend the legacy of compassion and resilience they had come to embrace. Elijah was the keynote speaker, his presence commanding yet humble as he stepped up to the podium. He spoke about the importance of perseverance, of pursuing one's dreams despite obstacles. He shared stories of his own journey, the hardships he'd faced, and the mentors who had believed in him along the way. George and Martha watched with pride as Elijah introduced the scholarship recipients, each one called to the stage to share their story. Among them was Tasha, a young woman who had been volunteering at the hospital since high school. Her parents, seated in the front row, beamed with pride as she shared her dream of becoming a neurosurgeon. "I grew up in a neighborhood where few people thought they could ever be doctors," Tasha said, her voice filled with conviction. "But people like Dr. Brooks and people like Mr. and Mrs. Harlan reminded me that dreams are possible. This scholarship gives me hope that one day I'll make a difference, just like Dr. Brooks has." The audience erupted into applause, and George felt a tear slip down his cheek. This was more than just an award. It was a legacy, a chance to give others the opportunity to build a life of meaning and service. After the ceremony, George and Martha mingled with the scholarship recipients and their families. The room was filled with laughter, handshakes, and heartfelt conversations. George spoke to Tasha and her family, sharing words of encouragement and offering his continued support. "You've already inspired us, Tasha," he said warmly. "And I know you'll inspire countless others. Keep going. The road might be long, but it's worth it." Tasha nodded, her eyes bright with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Harlan. It means so much to hear that from you." As they moved through the room, George and Martha felt an overwhelming sense of belonging. Each interaction, each smile reminded them of the transformation they had undergone, of the walls they had broken down within themselves. One young man approached George, introducing himself as Miguel. He was another scholarship recipient, hoping to study emergency medicine. "I read about you and Mrs. Harlan in the program," Miguel said with a shy smile. "I think it's incredible how you've turned your life around and found a way to give back. It makes me feel like I can do the same." George placed a hand on Miguel's shoulder, his voice filled with sincerity. "You absolutely can, Miguel. Life is a journey, and every day is an opportunity to be better than we were yesterday." The conversation left George feeling both humbled and inspired. For years, he'd seen the world through a narrow lens, unable to connect with people like Miguel, like Tasha, like Elijah. But now, he realized that the very differences he had once feared were the source of beauty, strength, and resilience. In the months following the scholarship ceremony, George and Martha became even more deeply involved in the community center, each small act of service reinforcing their newfound purpose. They organized mentorship programs, bringing in professionals to speak with young people about career opportunities and life skills. Martha coordinated a weekly book club for local youth, while George helped run a financial literacy workshop. As their involvement grew, so did the center's impact. The number of volunteers doubled, with people of all ages and backgrounds coming together to build a stronger, more connected community. The center became a hub of activity, hosting family events, workshops, and celebrations that brought people together in a spirit of unity and mutual support. One evening, George and Martha attended a community meeting at the center, where they were asked to share their story with new volunteers. George spoke with humility, recounting the journey they had taken from judgment to understanding. "Years ago, I would never have imagined myself standing here," he began. "But life has a way of teaching us things we didn't know we needed to learn. I thought I had the world figured out. But then, one day, I realized that my view was only a sliver of what's out there. And because of that realization, I found the courage to open my heart." Martha added, her voice warm and full of conviction. "We've learned that community isn't just about who you already know. It's about reaching out to people you don't know, people who may see the world differently. Because in the end, we're all connected. And when we choose to understand rather than judge, we make the world a little brighter for everyone." Their words resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom approached them afterward to express their admiration and gratitude. George and Martha left the meeting feeling renewed, aware that their lives were now a testament to the power of change. One afternoon, George received a letter from Elijah, written on elegant stationery. Sitting at the kitchen table with Martha, he read it aloud, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Dear George and Martha, I want to thank you again for the kindness and generosity you've shown, not just to me, but to so many others. Your story is one of courage, of choosing to confront the past and embrace a new future. You have shown me, and everyone around you, that it's never too late to grow, to learn, and to love. The Brooks Scholarship has already changed lives, and it will continue to do so for generations. This legacy is yours as much as it is mine. We may walk different paths, but in spirit, we are united in a shared mission to make the world a better place, one person at a time." With heartfelt gratitude, Elijah Brooks. George set the letter down, his eyes glistening with tears. He reached across the table for Martha's hand. Both of them moved beyond words. They felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that their efforts had made a tangible difference, that they had finally become the people they had always aspired to be. As the years passed, George and Martha continued to nurture the scholarship fund, welcoming each new class of recipients with open arms. They watched with pride as young people pursued careers in medicine, social work, and education, each one carrying forward the values of compassion and service. Their home became a gathering place for former scholarship recipients, now doctors, nurses, and educators who came to visit, sharing stories of their own work and the lives they'd touched. The friendships they formed transcended age, race, and background, rooted in a shared commitment to a better world. George and Martha had built a legacy, one born not out of wealth or fame, but out of a simple choice: to open their hearts, to listen, and to learn. Many years later, a new plaque was unveiled at the community center, honoring George and Martha Harlan's contributions. The inscription read, "In gratitude to George and Martha Harlan, whose journey from prejudice to understanding brought hope to countless lives. Their legacy is one of kindness, courage, and a belief in the power of change." At the dedication ceremony, Dr. Elijah Brooks spoke, his voice steady yet filled with emotion as he recounted George and Martha's story. "They were two people who dared to change, who dared to see the world anew," he said. "They showed us that it is never too late to open our hearts, to embrace those who are different from us, and to leave a legacy of love and grace." As the crowd applauded, George and Martha, now in their twilight years, sat together, hands entwined. They watched the young faces around them, knowing that their journey had come full circle. Their story was a reminder to all who heard it, that change is always possible, that compassion knows no boundaries, and that every person has the power to build a legacy of grace, one choice at a time. And as they looked out over the community they had come to love, George and Martha knew that their lives had been truly, deeply fulfilled. As George and Martha grew closer to the scholarship recipients, they took on more personal mentorship roles, especially with Tasha and Miguel. Both students had begun their medical school journeys and frequently visited George and Martha to share their experiences, ask for advice, and celebrate milestones. One afternoon, Tasha brought over her latest anatomy exam, beaming as she showed George and Martha the grade circled in red, a perfect score. "I couldn't have done it without you both," Tasha said, her voice sincere. Not only for the scholarship, but for believing in me. Knowing you've been there, cheering me on, has made all the difference. Martha took Tasha's hand, her own eyes glistening with pride. Tasha, you're doing this on your own merit, she replied. You have all the strength and determination to reach your dreams. We're just here to cheer you on. As they celebrated, George found himself reflecting on his own journey. Once, he had viewed the world in stark, rigid terms, never considering how his actions might limit others, or himself. But here he was a part of something greater, helping young people like Tasha and Miguel achieve dreams that would transform not only their lives, but the lives of everyone they would touch. One day, George and Martha decided to propose an event to honor Dr. Elijah Brooks for his work in the community and his influence on countless lives, including their own. They approached the community center's director with their idea, suggesting an annual Brooks Award for Compassionate Medicine, recognizing local healthcare professionals who exemplified the values Elijah had shown: kindness, empathy, and service. The director agreed wholeheartedly, and within weeks, the event was set in motion. Invitations were sent to doctors, nurses, social workers, and community members, each one touched by Elijah's impact. On the evening of the award ceremony, the hall was filled to capacity. Healthcare providers, families, former patients, and young scholarship recipients gathered to celebrate Elijah, whose contributions had gone far beyond medicine. His kindness had created ripples that spread throughout the community, inspiring others to act with the same integrity and compassion. When Elijah took the stage to accept the first Brooks Award, George and Martha watched with pride, knowing that this moment was not only a tribute to him, but a testament to the impact one person could have on the lives of many. Elijah, clearly moved, spoke to the crowd with humility. This award isn't just for me, he said, his voice strong but filled with emotion. It belongs to every patient I've treated, every colleague who has inspired me, and every member of this community. And I owe a special thanks to George and Martha Harlan. They've shown me that the journey toward understanding is one we take together, and I'm honored to be part of that journey with you all. The applause was thunderous, and as George and Martha exchanged a glance, they knew they had come full circle. Elijah had been a guide, a mentor, and a friend, and honoring him felt like the most meaningful way to express their gratitude. Over the years, the Brooks Scholarship Fund continued to grow, attracting donations from local businesses, former scholarship recipients, and community members. The scholarship became a hallmark of the community, known for supporting students who demonstrated resilience, compassion, and a commitment to service. With each new recipient, George and Martha felt a renewed sense of purpose. They attended every scholarship ceremony, welcoming each new class of students with warmth and encouragement. Their connection with these young people strengthened, bridging generational gaps and building bonds that enriched their lives. One year, they met a recipient named Jasmine, a first-year medical student who shared how the scholarship had allowed her to pursue her dream of becoming a pediatrician. Someday, I want to start a free clinic in my neighborhood, Jasmine said, her eyes shining with hope. I want to be there for kids who need care, who might not have anywhere else to go. And I know I can do that because of people like you. George felt a deep satisfaction as he listened to Jasmine's story. He knew that the ripple effect of Elijah's kindness, and now his own, was growing with every young person the scholarship supported. One quiet evening, George and Martha sat together on their porch, watching the stars emerge against the night sky. The cool air carried a sense of calm, a serenity they had come to treasure in recent years. As they reflected on all they had experienced, George turned to Martha, his voice soft but filled with emotion. I can't believe how much our lives have changed, Martha, he said. Sometimes it feels like we've lived two different lives. Martha nodded, her gaze thoughtful. Maybe we have, she replied gently. The people we used to be, they wouldn't have known how to open their hearts the way we do now. But I'm grateful we found our way here. It's never too late to become the person you want to be. They sat in comfortable silence, content with the knowledge that they had not only changed their own lives, but had left an indelible mark on the lives of others. For George, the journey had been one of humility, of learning to set aside pride and fear in favor of kindness and understanding. And for Martha, it had been a chance to see the world anew, to embrace the richness of diversity and the beauty of connection. Together, they had found a way to turn their past mistakes into a legacy of hope and grace. As they grew older, George and Martha gradually stepped back from their roles at the community center, allowing younger generations to carry forward the work they had helped establish. But their presence remained a cornerstone of the center's mission. Their story a source of inspiration for everyone who walked through its doors. The Brooks Scholarship Fund became one of the most respected awards in the community, supporting dozens of students each year as they pursued careers in healthcare, social work, and education. Many recipients returned to the community after their training, serving as mentors for future scholarship students and continuing the cycle of compassion and service. George and Martha attended the scholarship ceremony each year, watching as new recipients shared their dreams and plans for the future. The event became a celebration of community, a reminder that each person's story was connected to the next in ways they might never fully understand. The impact of George and Martha's journey, along with Elijah's influence, became woven into the fabric of the community, a testament to the power of change, the importance of kindness, and the enduring strength of forgiveness. Years later, after George and Martha had passed, the community center dedicated a mural in their honor, depicting scenes from their lives. Their work with the Scholarship Fund, their time spent mentoring youth, and their friendship with Dr. Brooks. At the dedication ceremony, Elijah, now retired, spoke to a crowd of community members, former scholarship recipients, and friends. His voice, though aged, was steady and filled with warmth. "George and Martha taught us all that it's never too late to change," he said. "They showed us that no matter where we come from, we can choose to be part of something greater, to give back, and to build bridges that bring people together." As the crowd applauded, Elijah looked at the mural, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for the journey he had shared with George and Martha. Their lives had become a symbol of redemption, a reminder that true transformation was always possible, no matter one's past. The mural stood as a permanent tribute, a visual reminder of the legacy George and Martha had left behind. Their journey from prejudice to understanding had not only healed their own hearts, but had woven threads of kindness and compassion throughout the entire community. In the years that followed, the community center continued to grow, welcoming new generations who found inspiration in George and Martha's story. And each time someone passed the mural, they were reminded that a single act of kindness could change everything. George and Martha's legacy were one of grace, a testament to the power of opening one's heart, and a reminder that every person had the potential to create a better, more compassionate world. Years after George and Martha's passing, the Brooks Scholarship continued to thrive, its annual ceremony evolving into a cherished community event that brought together families, students, and local leaders. This year, the event included a special tribute to George and Martha, honoring their legacy as the Scholarship Fund reached its 25th anniversary. At the ceremony, Dr. Elijah Brooks, now fully retired, attended as the guest of honor. Though his hair had grayed and his step had slowed, his presence still commanded deep respect. People throughout the community remembered Elijah not only as a doctor, but as the man who had inspired George and Martha to transform their lives. A young scholarship recipient named Simone was the keynote speaker that evening. Simone, inspired by George and Martha's story, had been accepted into a competitive residency program, where she planned to specialize in pediatric medicine. Standing at the podium, she took a deep breath, looking out over the audience. "I never knew George and Martha personally," she began, "but I've known their story my entire life. My parents would talk about them, about how they changed, how they made this scholarship possible, and how their journey taught all of us that compassion and understanding are within reach for everyone." Simone paused, her voice filled with emotion. "George and Martha's story has given me courage," she continued. "Because of them, I believe that kindness has the power to change lives. And I hope to carry that kindness forward, especially when the road gets tough." As Simone finished, the room filled with applause, the legacy of George and Martha's transformation woven into the dreams of yet another young soul. After the ceremony, Dr. Brooks mingled with former recipients, mentors, and community members. Among them was Tasha, one of the first students to receive the Brooks Scholarship years earlier. Now a well-respected neurosurgeon herself, Tasha had followed in Elijah's footsteps, carrying on the values she had admired in him and the Harlans. Elijah, this scholarship, it's grown beyond anything I ever imagined, Tasha said, her eyes shining. Every year, more students are applying, more donors are coming forward, and every recipient seems to carry a piece of George and Martha with them. Elijah nodded, his voice touched with reverence. They planted a seed, Tasha, and it grew because it was nurtured with intention, love, and a commitment to the community. As he spoke, Elijah looked around the room, seeing not just the faces of scholarship recipients, but the faces of those who had been indirectly impacted by George and Martha's journey. Their transformation had set off ripples of kindness, extending well beyond what either of them could have anticipated. Later that night, Elijah found himself walking alone in the quiet streets near the community center. Passing the mural that honored George and Martha, he stopped, taking a moment to reflect on all they had accomplished. In the years since their journey had begun, they had not only built a legacy, but had reshaped an entire community's understanding of compassion, empathy, and redemption. And for Elijah, their story served as a reminder of the power of small acts of kindness, of the ways people could change when given a chance. He thought back to the day he had first met George and Martha in the mall, how unlikely it had seemed that their lives would become so intertwined. They had been two people, like so many others, shaped by the biases they'd inherited, caught in the routine of their lives. And yet, through grace and determination, they had transformed into champions of the very kindness they had once dismissed. Standing there, Elijah felt both humbled and grateful to have witnessed their journey. It had taught him as much as it had taught them. In the following years, the scholarship fund continued to expand, eventually growing into a full foundation. Renamed the Harlan Brooks Foundation for Compassionate Medicine and Service, it provided financial support to students across the state and included internships, mentorship programs, and workshops in underserved communities. Former recipients of the scholarship returned to volunteer, each one contributing a piece of their story to the growing tapestry of the foundation's mission. Tasha, Simone, and Miguel became board members, helping to guide the foundation's growth and bring George and Martha's vision to new heights. The foundation's impact extended well beyond medicine, influencing fields like social work, education, and community development. The values of kindness, humility, and service that George and Martha had embraced became the foundation's guiding principles, inspiring hundreds of young people to follow in their footsteps. One year, at the foundation's annual gala, a young recipient named Raphael shared his story. He had grown up in challenging circumstances with few role models and never imagined he'd have the opportunity to attend college, let alone pursue his dream of becoming a teacher. People often told me that success was out of reach for someone like me, Raphael said, his voice steady but emotional. But when I learned about George and Martha's story, I felt a glimmer of hope. They reminded me that I could rise above my circumstances. Because of them, I'm here today preparing to give back to the students who need it most. The applause was thunderous, and as Raphael stepped down from the stage, Elijah felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that George and Martha's legacy was alive and growing, carried forward by each student who had been touched by their kindness. Many years later, after Elijah's passing, the community center held a gathering in his honor, recognizing his role in shaping the lives of countless people. The event included a dedication of a new wing at the center, named the Elijah Brooks Wing of Unity and Service, where future generations would continue the work that he, George, and Martha had begun. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, all connected in some way to the work of the Harlan Brooks Foundation. Former scholarship recipients, community leaders, and young people whose lives had been impacted by the foundation came together to celebrate Elijah's life and legacy. As they unveiled the new wing, a speaker shared words that encapsulated the spirit of George, Martha, and Elijah's journey. kindness knows no boundaries. It is the force that binds us, that teaches us to see beyond ourselves. And when we choose kindness, we choose a legacy that lives on forever. In that moment, George and Martha's story, woven into the fabric of the community, continued to inspire everyone gathered, reminding them that they, too, could make a difference. As time passed, the community flourished, shaped by the legacy that George, Martha, and Elijah had left behind. The Harlem Brooks Foundation continued to grow, creating new programs, reaching underserved populations, and supporting thousands of young people in their pursuits. George and Martha's journey from prejudice to understanding had become a legend in the community, a story shared at family dinners, in classrooms, and at community events. For those who knew it, their story was a reminder that it's never too late to change, to open one's heart, and to leave the world a better place than they found it. Young people who received the scholarship often visited the mural of George and Martha, finding inspiration in the faces of two people who had embraced grace and understanding. And as they stood before that mural, they felt the strength to move forward with kindness and determination. In the end, George and Martha's journey had transcended the bounds of their own lives, becoming a beacon of hope and compassion, a reminder that change is possible for anyone willing to take that first step. And so, the legacy of George, Martha, and Elijah lived on, carried forward by the generations who would follow, each one adding their own story to the tapestry of grace that had begun with a single, unexpected act of kindness. Thank you for following along with Unexpected Grace. If you enjoyed this story and want more heartwarming, transformative tales like this, make sure to hit the subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you don't miss out on future stories. Your support helps bring more inspiring narratives to life. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with friends who love a good story of change, compassion, and connection. Thank you for being part of this journey.